Head Programs and Deputy Head India Office. The new normal is our joint endeavor to stay connected and keep the dialogue going in these unprecedented times. We have an extremely distinguished panel of speakers who have led institutions, given vision to a variety of initiatives under their leadership. And I would to acknowledge the presence of all of them from various domains. I'm pleased to introduce our distinguished panel who are well known to all of you as leaders in their respective domains. Ambassador Mohan Kumar, who is currently Chairman, Research and Information System for Developing Countries, RIS. Also Professor and Vice Dean, Jindal School of International Affairs, OP Jindal Global University. Mr. Sanjoy Joshi, Chairman, ORF. Dr. Nagesh Kumar, Director, ESCAP, South and Southwest Asia. Ms. Dagmar Walter, Director, ILO, South Asia and India. Mr. Rajat Nag, Distinguished Fellow, NCAR and Emerging Markets Forum. Mr. Balbir Arora, Chairman, Center for Multi-Level Federalism, Institute of Social Sciences. Ms. Nishita Satyam, she, I think, is not joining, but anyway, she had indicated that she would join. Professor Ashish Bharadwaj, who is the Dean from Jindal School, and really Ambassador Mohan Kumar really connected him. I believe he's really an expert in this area. Rene, who was to join, is going to join through a message. He is the UNIDO representative India. Dipankar Tiwari, Managing Director India for Area 9. And very importantly, and most importantly, we have as moderator of today's session and discussion, we have Ms. Suhasini Haidar, who is the National and Diplomatic Affairs Editor of The Hindu, a distinguished journalist, has won several accolades during her illustrious career in the print and electronic media. So I think I would just like to welcome the panelists and leave it to Suhasini to take it over. And thank you all the participants. We have over 90 people online. So thank you, and over to you, Suhasini Haidar.
Right, Mr. Shnoy, thanks so much. And thank you to FICCI and KAS, Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, for really taking the leap of faith and saying, well, we need to move on with the dialogue, regardless of whether we are able to see each other, regardless of whether we are able to meet. I certainly hope the future is not going to be only virtual meetings like this one, but certainly it does bring to fore the question, in a world that has been so busy, do we need to look at different ways of doing the same things we've been doing? Each activity, in a sense, is up for reassessment. It's not just people. And it'll be adaptability and resilience of people that will be judged more. In a sense, the coronavirus, COVID-19 pandemic has really forced a pause. It's a forced pause for a world on steroids, if you like. It is forcing us to take the time to think about the kind of world we have built. It's forcing us to confront questions that many of us have only paid lip service to, whether it's global warming, climate change, pandemic threats, and so many other challenges in the world that we talk about but don't really get to. It's going to make us work harder at bridging the gaps between people around the world, whether it is in the digital divide, whether it is their access to food security and clean water. We're already seeing just the mini signs of what happens when you stop an entire population in its tracks, and the kind of numbers we have seen out on the streets, the numbers that need to suddenly be fed. People who are working, who are suddenly told that they have to go and sit inside a quarantine center and essentially live off somebody else providing them food. And we have to think about bridging the gaps between people around the world when it comes to access to medicines and healthcare. If one of us is sick, I think coronavirus has brought it very much home that the whole world can fall sick as a result. In the short term, we will focus on the other SDGs, as I call them, which is social distancing goals. But in the long term, we will need to get back to the UN and the world's self-set sustainable development goals at a much faster pace. We're going to have to try and marry all the advances we have made in technology, in artificial intelligence, in biotech, in space engineering. These things we are very proud of, but we're going to have to use them to try and do things like stop future pandemics. Finally, the question of how this is going to change leadership. How will leading countries, industries, ideas in a world change when you find that physical hierarchies and socialization is really going to give way to digital hierarchies and even digital distancing? So in terms of what we asked our panelists today, and each of them is an eminent person in their own field. So we're not going to try and broad brush a question when it comes to where the future of work is going. We asked them basically three questions. How has the COVID pandemic affected your area of focus? What will the lockdown mean for your field or area of focus in the short and in the long term? And who will be the most vulnerable and worst hit there? And finally, what do leaders, businessmen, planners, new entrants in the fields need to do to pandemic-proof, in a sense, the future of work? So it's a tall order, and it's made even more interesting by the fact that all our speakers are coming to it from different angles. I hope you'll enjoy the next hour and a half that we are going to put together. And we would love to take all the questions that you have. So please keep sending them in, and I will try to address them to the correct person. But if you could, in your questions, write who the question is meant for. It's a tall order, and it's made even more interesting by the fact that all our speakers are coming to it from different angles. I hope you'll enjoy the next hour and a half that we are going to put together, and we would love to take all the questions that you have. So please keep sending them in, and I will try to address them to the correct person. But if you could, in your questions, write who the question is meant for. It's a tall order, and it's made even more interesting by the fact that all our speakers are coming to it from different angles. I hope you'll enjoy the next hour and a half that we are going to put together, and we would love to take all the questions that you have. So please keep sending them in, and I will try to address them to the correct person. But if you could, in your questions, write who the question is meant for. It's a tall order, and it's made even more interesting by the fact that all our speakers are coming to it from different angles. I hope you'll enjoy the next hour and a half that we are going to put together, and we would love to take all the questions that you have. So please keep sending them in, and I will try to address them to the correct person. But if you could, in your questions, write who the question is meant for. It's a tall order, and it's made even more interesting by the fact that all our speakers are coming to it from different angles. I hope you'll enjoy the next hour and a half that we are going to put together, and we would love to take all the questions that you have. So please keep sending them in, and I will try to address them to the correct person. But if you could, in your questions, write who the question is meant for.
Impact of corona on the future of work will also vary from country to country, sector to sector, and I also dare say even within the same sector, from organization to organization. My second broad general remark is that India is sui generis, and therefore there are trends that you may see in Europe, in the West, or even in ASEAN and China that may not really apply to India for the following reasons. One specific sui generis reason for India that I have is the management style that we have in India. I don't want to really get into theory X and theory Y, and management students will know what I'm talking about. But just to say that there is a controlling, scrutinizing leadership style, and there is a decentralizing, liberal leadership style. I do believe Indians still tend to do the former rather than the latter. So that will have implications for what has now come to be known as remote work. The second thing is really the vast disparity that you have in India between digital infrastructure at office and digital infrastructure at home. I mean, as I said in the beginning, Ashish is my colleague from Jindal, and he will help explain what he has been doing, because we have a lot of professors who stay on campus, and we've been doing a lot of work there. But suffice it to say that India doesn't lend itself to these kind of things very easy. The third one is a productivity concern. I'm not, again, sorry to be a party pooper, but really I'm not entirely convinced that productivity can be substantially increased by remote work. I have had a chance to talk to other sectors as well. For example, the advertising sector, where I thought that is a sector which could lend itself to remote work. But if you ask a copywriter, he or she will tell you that actually it is getting together with others and then really discussing, thrashing ideas, and then you come up with the eureka moment. So there are sectors where you might think remote work will apply very well, it doesn't. And finally, of course, the sector to which I used to belong, I no longer belong, but government. I mean, I'm not revealing any secret when I say that government probably lends itself to the least kind of amenability for this kind of change of remote work. The reason is the fundamental nature of government is policy consultation, policy formulation, and policy implementation. So I see some future for digitalization and policy implementation, but both policy conception, policy formulation, and policy discussion, there is three things involved. One, there is a certain degree of confidentiality that is important in the government. And to really, make a joke of it, really confidential, as you know, is the least of the descriptions. We start with top secret and then confidential. So that should give you an idea of how just about everything that we do in the government is considered confidential. I think it's time we change that rule, by the way. Now that I'm out of the government, I can say that. But really, that's something that's crying out for change. The other thing is that even in the government, record keeping becomes very important. And record keeping, I'm not sure, again, is something you can do with remote work very easily. And thirdly, I would also say one of the main things that I did when I was Joint Secretary Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, a lot of my time was spent in meetings. Now, I know people can argue if you have physical meetings, what's the problem with having remote or electron or the kind of meetings that we are having now? The trouble is, and I have no problem confessing now, that most of the work actually got done outside the meetings on the sidelines.
Right.
That is when you are really talking to people and so on. So I really find it somewhat difficult, at least in the upper echelons of the government, for really remote work to make a case for itself. I would also say, however, that in the government, when there are lateral entrants and consultants, and we have started hiring a lot of consultants, for example, in the Ministry of External Affairs, those things can be done much more easily through remote work. So my concluding remarks, and I want to stick to the 5-minute rule so that we have time for questions.
Thank you.
I think there will definitely be a corona impact on the future of work. I think it will be very, very uneven across sectors. It will accelerate some trends, but I wouldn't go as far as to say that it is going to be cataclysmic. Second, economic activities can be classified into physically intimate activities and physically distant activities. I think it is the physically distant activities which can be really done through remote work. Most important example, or the classic example, being IT or consultancy. But the physically intimate part of activity, which is going to theaters or social events, or you're going to watch a cricket match, I don't see how you can make all this, frankly. I would like to believe that even post-corona, we are not going to be in this situation for an indefinite period of time. There will be a vaccine at some stage. We will go back to normal at some stage. So I don't see this as a permanent feature, and that is why I'm against those who think that this is going to be a paradigm shift. So the eventual outcome, if you like, is going to be the most important outcome for me, and I'll stop here, is going to be a hybrid model, which is you will have a bulk of people still going to office, but you will have increasingly a certain number of people who can work remotely from home. And what the What the proportion is will vary from sector to sector. Once again, thank you very much for the opportunity.
All right, interesting and a very upbeat start to the discussion. I'll turn to Sanjay Joshi, he's chairman at ORF, but of course has had a lifetime really studying energy, oil. What is the future really of our energy intake, as well as the diversification that is going to be forced, if you like, by the coronavirus pandemic? Over to you, Sanjay.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Swasti. It's a pleasure participating in this, and thank you to FICCI for organizing this. Let me continue what Ambassador Mohan was just saying. See, one of the most remarkable things which strikes you when you look at the impact of COVID, it is a great impact. It's a huge impact. The biggest impact is that we've actually seen how easy it is to throw a switch and shut down the economy. I mean, you can do it 4 hours from 8 o'clock, say, I'm going to shut down everything. The thing is that shutting down the economy is easy. Restarting that engine once you shut it down, unfortunately, is the more difficult part. But once you shut down the engine and parts of the machinery actually very rapidly rust from disuse, parts will need to be reconstructed afresh. There's a lot of things you will have to redo. So to say that Corona will not have an impact, it will have an impact. It will have a big impact. How big is the impact is going to depend on how long does this process last. And from what we are seeing, this threat is not going to go away soon. It is not going to magically end with the next lockdown date, whenever that may be. I think you are going to have to live with Corona for some time, maybe for 2 years, maybe for 3 years. And more importantly, the human race is going to have to learn to live with pandemics like this. They are going to recur. You will have to restructure certain things. So the revival of the economy, and therefore the revival of jobs, is going to be a slow process. Second, it is going to be not just a slow process, it is going to be an uneven process. Because this is going to be a slow, segmented revival. All parts of the economy will not move together. It will be segmented industry-wise, it will be segmented within parts of the chain, and it will also be geographically segmented. You are going to get into a situation where even after the lockdown ends, you will by fiat have certain areas declared as containment zones, where you have much severer restrictions on movements. Now, because it will be a segmented activity, your supply chains are going to be affected, and maintaining them is going to be the biggest challenge. This is not just about transnational supply chains. I'm even talking about short distance supply chains tied to the next district, which may be abruptly forced to follow containment restrictions, and so on and so forth. Now, when we start looking at what happens to jobs, how do jobs evolve? Well, the information knowledge economy, of which we as think tanks are very much part of, for us, it is easy to hasten our migration to cyberspace. Techno-optimists will probably see this as the wildest wet dream come true. Oh, the fourth IR is just around the corner, and you are now going to get into distributed manufacturing, and everything is going to be bits and bytes. No need for office space. Organizations' hiring requirements can shift. So the knowledge economy, the information economy will react to these changes in a different manner. But even to do that, the first requirement you're going to have to do is you need to rapidly upscale connectivity. In vast parts of the world, look at India for instance, you have the fundamental problems of connectivity. You do not have all areas connected. Now, I'm participating in the Zoom conference. I am using 2 mobile service providers. I'm using a broadband which is not working at the moment, but somehow I'm still being able to connect. Others are not even as lucky. So there are fundamental issues which arise when you start talking of knowledge economy. This is a transition which we will have to learn through. This is a transition we will have to live through. Now, the other parts of the economy, for example, I talked about supply chains. Supply chains can't be reduced to bits and bytes. There are hard things required there. Your norms for employing labor, as you are seeing the relaxations come in, as you're seeing we start talking about reopening the economy, those norms for employing labor with social distancing, instituting temperature scans, COVID testing, regular workplace sanitization, they're all going to add to effort and costs. Many small businesses will struggle to survive under this new kind of regulations which are going to have to come in. Now you're seeing a massive loss of agency. Agency is more and more shifting towards the state. And you're seeing how powerful state will be, how powerful state directions are going to be. Now, this is going to have an impact. It is going to affect how fast your economy is going to pick up in the future. It is, as I said, going to be a slow revival. And moving beyond that, the entire logic of the economically efficient industrial city, our cities were based on the premise that it is efficient to live together, efficient to live in large conglomerates where you can economize on various matters, the factors of production. So the city came into being. That whole thing is today turned into its head. Cities are the biggest health hazards. Your elevators are hotspots. Air conditioning a potential health hazard. So, as for example, when you saw in China from January 26th to February 10th, outbreak of the novel corona disease affected 10% of 3 families who had just gone to a restaurant in Wuhan, and it spread through air conditioning. So there are lots of things which people will get scared of. It'll have an impact of socialization, and the workplace as an area of socialization. So that completely kind of breaks down. So we are going to see major transformation in how industries tackle this new reality, how the new workplace gets to be defined. And yes, the entire workplace hierarchy, the system by how companies organize themselves, this is the way companies build their work cultures. A lot of this is going to change in the future. You are going to have Uberized workplaces. You have people working remotely. So interpersonal managerial controls are definitely going to slacken. You will need different kinds of managers. So, and the decline of the workplace as one of the most important agents of socialization is going to have an impact even on personal identity. So there are a lot of things which are going to transform, and businesses will have to reorganize, reorient. Bigger businesses may have larger problems getting into the new system. For a simple matter, getting labor to the workplace, you're seeing the back and forth which is going up, the changes in regulations. Every day MHA is coming out with new regulations.
Right.
You start the economy, can labor move to the workplace, not move to the workplace? How will it move to the workplace? How do you get the transport systems going? These are going to have a major impact. And to conclude, because opening of the economy is going to be segmented, it is going to be uncertain. There is uncertainty, and this uncertainty is going to pervade for some time around how your economic revival and how your jobs actually move and pick up in the future. Thank you.
All right. Thanks so much. And I'm going to come back to you later, maybe about the energy questions in particular, Dr. Joshi. If I could turn to Dr. Nagesh Kumar, he's been very patient because I know you have another meeting coming up. He's the director and the head of the South and Southwest Asia office of UNESCAP, which is Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific. Dr. Nagesh Kumar, give us your thoughts on where you think this is going. We've had 2 fairly opposite views so far about just how much COVID will change the world.
Thank you, Suhasini, and thank you, FICCI and CAF for organizing this and giving us this opportunity to brainstorm a little bit on this massive, change that we are passing through of COVID. I would like to talk about the impacts the COVID is having or going to have on the SDGs or Sustainable Development Goals that all the countries of the world are trying to achieve by 2030, in particular on poverty and the inequality. Jobs, of course, have been very, very badly affected. And for a youthful country, a country passing through youth bulge in its demographic transition, it is a major issue that we are going to have loss of many, many jobs. And then that leads to poverty goal of the SDG, which is goal 1. And there are numbers floating, and it is too premature to give any precise figures. But there are numbers floating that South Asia and particularly India may be, getting an impact on poverty to the extent of say 80 to 120 million people getting pushed back into extreme poverty. The poverty defined at $1.9 a day. And if that is the impact going to be eventually, because we are not out of it, and so it's very premature to give any numbers. But if that happens, then it is actually reversing the gains in poverty reduction of more than a decade. And that's a very unfortunate situation. The second thing which is related to it, because the vulnerable sectors, especially the workers working in the informal sector who have no access to social security, and government is of course trying to give them something, but as they organized and structured social protection they do not enjoy. And the vulnerable sectors are at the front line of this corona impact. The inequalities, we have talked about inequalities rising in India for a long time, and we know the statistics that only 10% of top strata, of the population account for more than 55% of income. So that is going to be further widening of inequality. So we are going to see a huge increase and widening of income inequalities in the times to come. And the other thing is that, and the previous two speakers have talked about that it will accelerate the digital revolution, or the artificial intelligence and cloud computing kind of thing, which have been projected already to lead to a lot of job losses. We have been already witnessing a jobless growth kind of scenario in India. And for a youthful country, this is going to be a very, very bad or adverse impact. And if COVID is going to accelerate that trend, because number of industries are witnessing how they can do away with physical or manual workers and turn to robotics or artificial intelligence. So that is a major issue, and we need to look at how best to diminish or counter these or mitigate these adverse impacts. So now just let me turn to briefly to the pandemic proofing, the question that Suhasini mentioned in the beginning. What can we do to proof the country for future pandemics? I think the pandemic has exposed two deficiencies of our system. One is the lacks or gaps in the public health system and the coverage towards health insurance or something like that. The other gap it has exposed is about gap in social protection. So I think if we begin to close these two gaps, we would be not only sort of future proofing India, the country, with any future pandemics, and of course respond to this pandemic while it is going. And Mr. Joshi said that we may be living through it for next 2-3 years. Certainly possible, because we do not have as of now any cure or a vaccine which is demonstrated to be effective. So if we are going to live through this pandemic, and there will be future pandemics and other disasters, so if we expand the health coverage in India towards a universal health coverage, and also the social protection, especially the vulnerable sections of society, the workers in the informal sector, for instance, if we cover them gradually and towards a universal social protection, so that basic minimum amenities of life are guaranteed to everyone, which is the goal of sustainable development goals. So we work on these two. I think we will not only be future-proofing country for any future pandemics, but also we will be accelerating the progress towards sustainable development goals. And the final point I would like to make is that to disincentivize the industries or sectors to move towards the robotization of at a gross scale, I think India should consider a robot tax. This is a country which can least afford substitution of workers by robots, and so the robot tax could be one of the mechanisms for disincentivizing the replacement of humans by robots, and then the revenue collected from that tax could be put to a good use in terms of funding social security programs, social protection programs. Thank you. I'll stop here.
Right. Thank you so much. And that robot tax is something that that I think should be part of the summary of this, because this takes us to our next speaker. And I know Dr. Nagesh Kumar has to leave, but it brings us to Dagmar Walter, who's the director of the ILO's Decent Work technical support team, or Decent Work team of the ILO. And there's the coronavirus actually divides the world into two, in a sense. As Dr. Nagesh Kumar said, that here you have already a migrant worker crisis. You have labor running out of jobs. He's talking in terms of 80 to 120 million people just here losing their jobs. And on the other hand, coronavirus pushes one towards digitalization, which Dr. Kumar, for example, says should be slowed down in a sense. You should stop having robots or artificial intelligence taking over people's jobs when they are losing jobs so quickly. How do you see the future panning out, Ms. Walter? And if you could speak a little bit about what kind of impact this is going to have on gender and women, who are sometimes not in any case the first in line to get some of these jobs.
Thank you very much, Suhasini, and good morning to you all. We are indeed in the middle of the crisis, and at the outset, I would first like to send a solidarity message to all those businesses suffering today and all those workers losing jobs, income opportunities, as well as health workers and other workers who are engaged in the immediate COVID-19 response. And as you may know, in particular, the health sector also holds a lot of women workers, and we can look back to that sector later maybe. Well, for the International Labour Organization, this crisis goes to really the very heart of our mandate to improve economic, social and environmental outcomes in the world of work, in line with the Sustainable Development Goals that Mr. Kumar mentioned just before me. So, and we do this at both, of course, the global, but in particular the national level. So right now we do everything we can to support our tripartite constituency, which is governments, employers and workers' organization, to fight this battle. This includes, of course, thinking of how to get back to economic activity and the functional labor market, preparing for a new normal with COVID-19 around. I want to upfront recognize that actually in this FICCI and other employer and business member organizations play a very important role. And here this is demonstrated by FICCI, who is part also of ILO's employer constituents in India. And this dialogue we are having today is really one of the examples and only one among the many that FICCI is taking. So I want to thank you for that. So how do we shape the new normal? And we need strong employee organizations who can both engage with the government and workers at all levels. And this is at central level, but all the way down to the workplaces. And another area where employers have a stake related to the need of a better functioning and extended social protection system. Some speakers have mentioned it before me. The crisis in India today has really brought to light all the dramatic effects of an ever large informal and unorganized sector. So this needs to be addressed as we work towards a new normal. Now, the ILO newest estimates and analysis of April this month show that up to 400 million workers in India are at direct risk of falling into poverty or deeper into poverty. This has to be addressed in working towards the new normal as well. ILO constituents have already devised actually on how to do that, and I wish to refer to international labor standards, which actually prove an excellent guidance also in times of crisis. We have specific recommendations on this that have been worked out by the constituents. And all these materials which concern the world of work are really available also in good practices around the globe on our website that we are gathering. So you asked me about women workers and the gender aspects. I think this relates a lot to the also supply chains. We support dialogue and better conditions, for example, in global supply chains, especially the tier 3 and 4 workers. And here we have a lot of home-based workers. And those really are extremely hard hit today. I mean, the chains have been broken, so to say, and there is no kind of, access market. All of this has been stopped right now. So even what they have produced often is just lying there. And for now, of course, everyone is waiting to see how this can pick up again. And that is really overall something as the ILO with the constituents, we look at how do we create and shape this new normal that is human-centered. This was a call by the constituents in particular, also in the plenary declaration that they adopted in June last year, and which is extremely valid, about investing in people, investing in business, investing in institutions, which really relates to the governance aspect of this whole puzzle, so to say. And of course, by extension, that means also to take care and be respectful of the planet. So there are really, to summarize, 4 main areas which work together. And the first one is around stimulating the economy and employment. And it will have to be a job-led recovery. And then second, to support enterprises, jobs, and also the livelihood incomes, in particular here in India. And then a very important part, which I may stress a little bit more, is the third one, which is on protecting workers in the workplace by, among other things, strengthening occupational and safety and health measures and provide health access to workers, adapt the working arrangements, and prevent also discrimination, prevent from discrimination and exclusion. And finally, but which is really essential, and that's why I started off with it, is about social dialogue for better solutions. I see signs here in India actually that, there are calls, for example, that there should be more. Certain states have brought this out, that there should be a ban on unionization, etc. I think in these times, actually, better solutions are found and can be adhered to when we have a constructive dialogue and engagement, as I said, at all levels, with the actors who actually have to work together to get this economy back on feet. So that is really a strong call from the ILO side. And we always stand ready, of course, to support initiatives. And I would like to also extend a call from our Director General, Guy Ryder, who says that we must aim to build back better so that our new systems are fairer, safer, and more sustainable than those that allowed this crisis to happen. So there, sure. I think, and then we have, of course, yes, migrant workers, the MSMEs, more gender aspects, and I will be happy to engage on that in the discussion. Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks so much. I'll turn now to Dr. Rajat Nag, who's a distinguished fellow at the NCER, the National Council for Applied Economic Research. He's also a distinguished fellow at the Emerging Markets Forum in Washington. Dr. Nag, there's already almost a war bugle been set out there by Dr. Kumar, who suggested that actually we have to slow down, in a sense, not digitalization, but slow down the artificial intelligence inroads into our workspace, simply because we will not have a sustainable world in terms of the labor force that's already existent and having to feed and clothe so many. Take us through what you think are going to be the broad trends when it comes to the future of work.
Thank you. Thank you very much for giving this opportunity, Suhasini. Let me make 3 points, and I'll come to the point that Nagesh made just in a little while. First, starting off with the point that Ambassador Mohan had made, that I think the pandemic that we are now in has not created anything fundamental, but has certainly hastened the transition. I mean, we've talked about automation, we've talked about artificial intelligence, robotics for a long time. What I think has happened now is that the speed of transition has been hastened. In a study done a couple of years back by McKinsey, they covered 46 countries. And a very interesting point was that between now and 2030, about 15% on an average of the activities would be displaced. Work activities would be displaced. Now, India was at 9%, China 16, USA I think was about 23, 24%. And also it said that almost about 75 million to 375 million workers would essentially have to switch occupations. And they would have to do that by adapting to higher skills, digital skills, obviously, greater use of technology and adapt. Now, an immediate consequence of this is exactly, I think, what Nagesh is saying, is the digital divide will get exacerbated. And that concerns me, just as it concerns everybody else, because this digital divide will mean that those who can adapt, those who are at the higher end of the education spectrum will actually benefit. They'll see their incomes go up, but those who are not will fall off. Where I would disagree with my very good friend Nagesh is to try to put something in the way of that development. What I think governments have to do, certainly in India, is work on enhancing the education opportunities, higher education, greater skills, and FICCI I know has been very involved in that. I think history shows us that you cannot stand in the way of innovation. You cannot stand in the way of technical progress. It's much better to be a part of it and take advantage of it. And certainly India can take huge advantage of it because of its young population, computer savvy population. We have our own sort of major competitive advantage in that. So, Nagesh, I fully share your concerns very much about the rising poverty, people who will slip back. I'm very concerned of rising inequality. I would differ with you, I think, on how we go about it. And rather than robotic tax, I would sort of put in incentives for higher education and a social safety net. But we certainly can discuss more about that. My second point, Suhasini, is on the effect of what's happening now on the global supply chain and effect on globalization. And I think a couple of speakers, Professor Jain has already alluded to it, that production facilities which are linked in intricate supply and production networks, regionally, globally, obviously have been affected. And they obviously were put in because of significant economic advantages. And now they've obviously caused corresponding pain. And my concern is that this will be used by many as a voice or a rationale against globalization. Now, obviously, one has to recognize that globalization has its benefits, lower costs for one, just-in-time production from all over the world and also maybe the next district. But when something like this happens, the whole chain gets disrupted. So my concern is that this pandemic will also have an effect on the benefits of globalization. And very regrettably, I think when the world needs much more cooperation, we are seeing just the opposite. You're seeing what's happening vis-a-vis some very, very important organizations such as WHO. I think ILO has a very important role to play. And this is when I think the international cooperation should be much deeper. Unfortunately, I think the pressures are against it, and the supply chain disruptions are going to exacerbate that and give more voice to the naysayers. My third and last point, because I want to stay within my time limit, Suhasini, is
Thank you.
I think one good thing, hopefully, which will come out of all of this that we are saying, though I fully appreciate Ambassador Mohan's point about you can't have remote working for everybody, obviously, it has to be calibrated. But I hope very much that there will be a positive gender effect of what we are seeing, that there is a greater appreciation of the work-life balance, particularly for women. And the extended period that we're going through of remote work, I hope drives home the point that working from home does not mean not working. And the bosses, and unfortunately most of them are males around the world, would hopefully, I think, realize that a lot can be done productively. Not everybody, but a lot can be done productively without physically being at the office. And I think the very definition of being at work will no longer have to be synonymous of being at the office. Now, again, I have to nuance it. I fully agree with Ambassador Mohan about it can't be a one size fits all. But a greater realization, I'm hoping very much, will emerge what it takes to run a house and an office at the same time. You've got to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. And this is where juggling the child's schoolwork, doctor's appointments with demands of the office will all lead us to some sort of appreciation of the work-life balance. So I'm hoping very much out of this will come some greater appreciation of the work-life balance, which will help everybody, I hope, particularly the women. Let me stop there.
All right. Well, we all hope that there is a greater appreciation of what women do. In a sense, somebody has pointed out, though, that work from home is really the new living in the office, because you're actually working much longer hours and constantly being needed. But a lot of what you said brings us really to our next speaker, Dr. Balveer Arora. He's the chairman of the Center for Multi-Level Federalism at the Institute of Social Sciences. You know, there's something very interesting that we heard just now from Dr. Nag, where he said that actually there will be a push against globalization. There's a greater nationalized feeling. And it might not just be national, it might go down the federal chain and become more about communities. I know one of the repercussions of coronavirus, if you like, is communities now see how they can be self-sustaining on their own. Do you see that kind of trend? And what else do you think the pandemic's going to throw up?
Well, thank you, Suhasini, and I'd like to thank Vicky and Cass for organizing this. I'll take my cue from your initial remark when you said that we were in a position of forced pause. And I'll take both those words. Forced in the sense that it has required an enormous amount of force to pause us. So the extensive use of forces of law and order. And the second thing is that in a pause, normally you pick up where you left off. And that is the first point that I'd like to briefly interrogate, which is that, is this a parenthesis? Is this a defining moment? Or is it something that will come back the status quo ante, which is that there's a force of inertia which will pull us down to remain and resume where we left off. So the force of inertia and the power, and that's the second point I would make, the power of vested interests in the old model. Because there are a number of things that we appreciate about this new pause, including whatever advantages or disadvantages they may have from working at home. And that question has been very extensively dealt with. But I would say that it concerns white collar workers. And as far as education is concerned, working from home is not a good idea. I think the essence of education is interaction with students, with children, and there's a limited amount that you can do with MOOCs, these massive online courses, and there's certainly a limitation. But there have been good things that we have noticed, notably the clean air and the lack of pollution. And let us also think on those lines as to whether the resumed activity can be different. Finally, I would draw attention to the fact that not just in the workplace, but the political agendas that were at work before we stopped have not paused. There's no truce. There's no feeling that everything has been set aside while we deal with this. These agendas keep surfacing. I give you the example of Hong Kong. In Hong Kong, what better moment to arrest pro-democracy activists than when they are locked up at home? And so they've been very easily rounded up. So while the fight against the pandemic is going on, other agendas are not on pause. The second point that I would like to make is the question of uneven advantages in this whole debate on schooling at home. Schooling at home, Bourdieu pointed out to us long ago, is that there is something called social capital. And my thoughts go to first generation learners, whether at the school level or in the colleges and universities. They don't have the possibility of learning from home because they don't have the social capital around them, the parents and so on, who will enable them to replace formal teaching. The second thing, of course, which has been pointed out, is the very uneven distribution of infrastructural facilities, on which distance learning depends. The future of work, in my mind, involves equal access to jobs, the equality of citizens. Now, if exclusionary agendas are as an undercurrent of the lockdown, and if some communities will emerge strengthened while others will emerge weakened, then we have to pay attention to that. The experience has been that when there is a pause, social forces continue to operate, social animosities continue to function, social fractures, social cleavages do not disappear. So when we come to the other side of the pause, we have to look carefully as to what has changed in the social equations, the social balances. So that was the second point that I wanted to make. I'll try and squeeze it within the time you've given me. The third point, and I think you were referring to that, I won't take up the bigger issue about the global level of multilateralism and how it will emerge from this. Let me focus on the community. A functional multi-level governance system is the most likely to deliver results, not just during pandemics, not just during crises, but also in normal times. And the development of state capacity at multiple levels, not just the development of a strong regulatory central state capable of enforcing a lockdown, but a multi-level welfare state capable of meeting the needs of the citizens is something that would serve us in good stead. As I said, it's not just for now, it's something that we need to pick up when the crisis is over, and therefore pandemic governance can reinforce either uneven state capabilities, state capacities between levels which get carried forward, or we use this as a moment to ponder on what levels need to be strengthened. The fourth point that I would like to mention is what has been brought home to us in a very big way is the importance not just of health, but of healthcare workers. As we know, we have invested very poorly in healthcare. We have gone for a healthcare system which relies more on insurance than on building the public health system. Roughly 40% of healthcare is this public health system, 60% is private. But India, as we all know, spends a pitiful not even 1% of our GDP. So I think if there is anything that this health crisis, because there's a governance crisis which has to be tackled differently, but if there's anything that this health crisis has to teach us, it is how do we want to carry forward the task of strengthening not the National Health Service, but our own public health service that we are we may need. That's the point that's been brought out. Viruses and pandemics will come again, and will we be in the same state of unpreparedness as this one found? Finally, as I said, what would we like to carry forward? That is my concern in this whole debate, is that given the force of inertia and given the expected outcome of everything falling back into place because vested interests will push for that, the controversy of the day after, the contours are already discernible. We know what we are leaving behind, and we also know that all the agendas, all that divided us before the coronavirus overtook us, all those things are there, and we will have to work harder to see that they don't pull us further down. Thank you.
All right. Very sobering look at some of the challenges ahead, and particularly the question of, after this pause, will we pick up where we left off? What is on the other side of the pause? And very important point you made there, that the investment in the healthcare system should be like the first thing every government does when they come out of this. Let's turn now to Mr. Dipankar Tiwari. He's the Managing Director of India and for India and Southeast Asia of Area 9 Lyceum. Very interesting platform for learning engineers, as they are called. And you have a background as well with Uber. You have a background in so many different corporate fields. We'd love to hear from you about what you think the future of work is going to be, just in terms of, look at some of these industries like transport that have just been shut down entirely for 2 months. And this is not just aeroplanes and the airspace that we hear the most about, in a sense, but also just cab services, also all kinds of transport, railways, and all the rest. What is this going to do to the future of work and in terms of learning as well?
Thanks, Suhasini, and thank you, Vicky panel, for inviting me over. A couple of points here. First is from the learning and development kind of perspective. I think a lot's been said about how post the pause things will look at, and some of the trends are already very visible. What we've been seeing, I'm very deeply involved with the Air9, which is kind of an adaptive learning platform. There is a huge kind of interest coming in from the manufacturing sector, which employs large, let's say, blue-collar workers in terms of transitioning them from low-skill laborers to high-skill. How do you get them to that migration to happen? So we see a lot of interest coming in from multiple SMEs, large manufacturing entities, automotive side, etc., where there is a lot of work already happening, figuring out post-pause, how are we going to engage this blue-collar workforce? What are the skill sets they need to do? I think a point was raised around the poor connectivity in India in general. Yes, that's also the case, but there is also a very large penetration of smartphones, and somehow they're able to access a lot of content and material, provided it's kind of given to them in the right way, in the right perspective. So we're seeing some of these trends already taking place in a very big way as we sit quietly over the last 2-3 weeks. But the fact is, most of these large employers have been building some of these capabilities and trying to, and I'm talking of the blue collar or the lower end or the lower skill spectrum of workers, and trying to transition them to be more skilled and more adaptive to the new environment, which they will see post pause. So that's generally what's the trend which is happening, and then that's a reassuring side for people to kind of equip themselves and come back to work post the COVID crisis. On the mobility side, yes, we do have a challenge. For example, I mean, I'm not looking at the general airline industry also, but at the lower end of the spectrum, wherein we had the ride-hailing services like Uber, Ola. We do see a huge stress in the system there, because most of this workforce, or the driver kind of category of workforce, has moved away from towns and not being able to sustain. And more, the issue would be post-COVID, the general fear factor, the general sentiment of being able to use some of these services is going to play high on consumers' mind. So that peters out the demand. But again, we are all looking at more different forms of personal mobility and trying to again equip some of this workforce which has left the traditional ride hailing which was there, in terms of metamorphosing themselves into different sorts of skill sets. So I think broadly what I would say is the industry, and I just mentioned, is already has started this journey towards equipping their larger workforces towards a higher kind of skill sets, and they're developing that roadmap is already being chalked out as we've seen over the last 4 weeks of shutdown. The last point which I would mention is, I think one of the speakers mentioned about how easy it is to shut down, and that's been a bit of a worry for the industry per se, because that also kind of starts reflecting in the broader investment sentiments and obviously job creation, which was for the future. Having said all of that, but in the long run, I would still see a very optimistic picture and think that we would come back to the normal, even if it's a new normal, but it'll be a good normal. It's like to end that.
All right. Interesting. And since you haven't taken up all your time, I do want to quickly bring a question to you that we've got from Ambassador Rajiv Bhatia already. And he's really talking about something you just mentioned, that on the one hand, you have connectivity, and the other hand, you have the affordability and access of communication technologies. Do you think, in a sense, we're in this weird position now where actually connectivity and access to communication are almost pitted against each other? In other words, if we are going to improve our communication technologies, we may not need connectivity as much. And in a sense, they are going to fight for the same dollar.
My answer to that is, I think all of us are, so while the connectivity is somewhat challenged in some of the areas, but a lot of our technology platforms are also working towards how do you build effective communication in a low connectivity environment. I mean, some of our, so that's what we've seen. So there is a lot of work which has already happened. Given India and the constraints that we have, how are you able to really pass on information or bring tools in the areas of lower end connectivity environment? So that already is happening. So I wouldn't say we are really fighting for the same dollar. The tools that we provide is an outcome of the connectivity which would be there, and that would help the larger workforce to actually equip themselves, reskill themselves, and be more relevant in the post-COVID times in the new normal which happens.
All right. Well, since you did speak on learning, let's expand that theme a bit. bring in Professor Ashish Bhardwaj. He's the Dean of the Jindal School of Banking and Finance, Executive Director Orbit, Founding Director JACO at the OP Jindal Global University. Professor Bhardwaj, the future of learning has been discussed by practically every speaker today, but it is to you we turn as the expert to understand what you really think is going to be the future, because as one of the speakers did point out, the essence of education is in the interaction. Are we going to turn completely digital? And I just did want to bring up a question we'd had from Amit Chaudhary of the UN International Organization of Migration. No, I'm sorry. There was a different question that we'd gotten from Utkarsh Joshi, who's a lawyer of Supreme Court of India, who said whether so far non-scalable industries such as teaching and law are going to become scalable. So you have both sides of that question. Is it actually that education will become some majorly scalable industry because of digital, or is it because the essence of education remains interaction, so it cannot be scaled? Over to you. I think you're still on mute. You need to unmute your.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thank you for inviting me. Short answer to your question, Suhasini, universities will have to scale up. There is no other choice. There is no other option. I will restrict myself to commenting on the industry that I am familiar with the most, higher education. And I'll just start off with asking a question. How many of us have someone in our immediate or extended family who's worried about board exams, admissions to a university of their choice, or career prospects? I do, several, right? And for students particularly, this phase, this chaotic phase is it just means a huge loss of learning, with repercussions that will probably have to be borne for a few years to come, unfortunately. UN has told us that there are about 157 crore students who will have to deal with this. That's more than 1.5 billion students across 191 countries. And to put that number in perspective, it's 1/5 of the world's population, right? And most nations still don't know what to expect next, just because of the nature of this problem. It's like two goldfish in a tank, one looking at the other and saying, do you know how to drive this thing? And they're both in it together. But the fact of the matter is that this pandemic, lockdowns will have varying degrees of impact on little less than 4 crore students. That's 40 million that are enrolled in high school education in India. I'm talking about India now. And again, to put that number in perspective, that's the combined population of South America, right? Close to 40 million. Now, Dr. Nag mentioned when he was speaking that there is a big demographic advantage we could take advantage of, demographic dividend. But despite being the world's youngest country in terms of this demographic profile, we only have 2% of the workforce that's currently skilled. And that number is extremely small compared to the 60%, 70%, 90% in the US, Germany, and South Korea. Now, online teaching, virtual learning is definitely a recourse. We all know that. And the university where I work, the classes, day-to-day classes, and more than 500 courses across so many degree programs went online from today. As we speak, there are classes happening. And we are not alone in this. Several universities have done that. But we all know the problem. If I cannot get uninterrupted and very stable internet sitting in the heart of Delhi, then it's quite believable that many teachers and students in remote areas will not have reliable network. We all know that. But overall, some students will be more affected, including those who are transitioning into universities and those who are going to be graduating. Now, this year, close to, I believe, 1.5 crores, that's 15 million, will be appearing in school-leaving board exams in India. Most of them will be looking to get enrolled in a university this year itself. And there will be challenges. Graduating students in some of the premier higher education institutions in India may have less of a challenge because they've had pre-placements, which pretty much start around November all the way till March. But a large segment of graduating students will have to wait for some more time before they get absorbed in the job market. This essentially means that some students are starting to realize that they are going to be graduating into a global recession, just like how it happened 11 years ago. Now, universities that rely on foreign students will be badly hobbled. I want to really mention this here because we, just like so many other universities, we have a very strong network of partnerships around the world. Now, with countries that are being overrun by COVID, and that includes US, Germany, Australia, UK, which are preferred destinations for Indian students, the slowdown, the already slowing down of foreign student enrollments could come to a really grinding halt. And that's something students should really understand and account for. But be that as it may, Indian students wanting to study abroad, particularly at an undergraduate level, will have to more seriously consider Indian universities. Now, there is a silver lining here, if at all there could be one during this time. This can help in transforming India, perhaps, from a sending market for students, which has been happening for so many years now, into a retaining market with the hope that we eventually become a receiving market for good students to feed into our universities. The last point I want to make is the macroeconomic impact of all of this. It will be that the global inequalities in access to education, which some of the other speakers have alluded to, that's going to widen, and the global the learning crisis may actually be exacerbated. Now, lockdowns will disproportionately affect the education systems in low-income countries or low-middle-income countries, including India. And in our country, the risk to the most marginalized is the maximum. We all know that. But why is it the case? And I'll end there. Because there is a real danger that the temporary interruption in learning because of lockdown, because of the pandemic, could become permanent for them. It won't be temporary. I'll stop here. Thank you. Back to you, Suhasini.
All right. Thanks so much. And thanks for taking that question as well. We'll come back to you with more. But finally, we have a speaker, Mr. Rene van Berkel. He's the UNIDO representative at the India office, who has actually sent in a video message because at the last minute, he wasn't able to join us. So let's just play that. And then we'll come to all your questions.
Thank you to Vicky and the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung for putting together this most timely virtual dialogue on the consequences of the global pandemic for the future of work. The United Nations Industrial Development Organization is pleased to contribute to this debate. I regret that at the last moment I could not join live. Undoubtedly, during the COVID crisis, things are already different, and post-COVID, in maybe a year or two, it will be again different. Hence, there will be indeed a new normal. At the outset, though, in terms of consequences, it might be useful to differentiate between the pandemic itself and the impact of the policy measures. The pandemic is a health emergency and stresses the global healthcare systems in India, but also in countries with much higher incomes. Policy responses have curtailed the movement of people and halted the economy and society. Future will tell what will have had the greatest impact. At the moment, though, it seems in India the biggest impact is from the policy measures. However, less firm policy action would have been at the risk of more widespread health crisis. So what is already different? Based on UNIDO's stocktake in the MSME manufacturing clusters over the past week, we observed 5 changes. First of all, uncertainty has risen greatly. What will happen next? How can we work with COVID as a hostile partner in our business? Secondly, there's undoubtedly plummeted demand. Halting of the global economy and its falling in recession has resulted in abrupt changes in product demand and markets. Workforce turnover is also there. Massive return of unskilled and lower skilled migrant workforce in panic and despair for food, shelter and livelihoods. If businesses are to restart, they will have to restart largely with a new workforce. There has also been an instant devaluation of inventories and machinery. Companies have stocks of raw materials that are no longer useful, and the machines have stand idle with lacking maintenance. And fifth, of course, supply chains are thoroughly disrupted at the moment. Each of these contributes to a heavy cash flow crunch, and hence access to working capital will be critical for bouncing back. Bouncing back will not be instant. The process of turning current worries into actionable plans for the future is unfortunately still largely to start. The future of work can differentiate between impacts typically observed in terms of economic recession, in terms of layoff, unemployment. In addition, though, there will be specific challenges, qualitative challenges. Let me elaborate on three. First, in terms of the global value chains. The severity of the impact has been augmented by the interrelatedness of the global value chains. Paradigms of efficiency had created lean but vulnerable global value chains. Car assembly plants globally came to stand still due to lacking parts from China. In bouncing back, there will be more focus on resilience, which comes with more diverse and localized supply chains. This could be an opportunity for India, make in India. Secondly, will be the relationship with nature. As many have highlighted, zoonotic diseases as COVID-19 are a reflection of infringement of humans on nature and wildlife. May COVID-19 therefore also be a wake-up call to redress the human-nature balance. Undoubtedly, that would have widespread benefits in terms of climate, environment, biodiversity, and indeed the abilities of future generations to live their lives. Thirdly, that's perhaps most immediate, will be the implications of the 6 feet economy. COVID-19 will be with us for the immediate and midterm future. Key actions are distance, hygiene, and elimination of touch points. We have to decongest workplaces and improve worker productivity in manufacturing. This will add to competitiveness, better occupational health and safety, but also fewer jobs for unskilled people. There will be a push for working from home, particularly in commercial service sector. This will decongest roads, but may also put stress on families, as we have already seen that the work-life balance is changing, and there's a difference between having the freedom of working occasionally from home and having the routine of working from home. It's also likely that e-commerce will flourish, but what will then the implications be for the retail, the hospitality, and the entertainment industries? I will finish here. I realize I might have thrown more questions than solutions, but that is a reflection of our current understanding of the pandemic and its implications. We are united in our worries. Where will this pandemic take us? It's good to acknowledge these worries as a fundamental starting point, yet also for taking a proverbial deep breath, reflect on the situation, and come up with actionable plans for more sustainable and inclusive economy and society. Thank you.
All right, before I go any further, I would like to take a moment just to applause for all our speakers who have really spent some energy, not just in putting out their thoughts, but in putting their thoughts in a concise manner so that we can get through this entire thing. I'm going to run straight to the questions now. And if there is a question that one of you also wants to refer to, that's fine. But what I'm going to do, because we're dealing with this particular format, is pick and choose which question I'm going to send to whom. Ambassador Mohan Kumar, a lot of questions about how, the question that I think Professor Balbir Arora brought up, that if 1% of your healthcare or of your GDP is being spent on healthcare, how does the government change that immediately? And then there's a really interesting question, which I think you might want to refer to. It says, in a sense, the pandemic has brought out the best in Indian governance, efficient bureaucracy, and arguably political leaders working, for and by and large rule-abiding citizens. So, how does the government ensure that when the threat of the pandemic recedes, how do they ensure that this momentum doesn't just fade away in a short time? And this is the last question that's come from Adeep Puri. He's a senior consultant at APCO. The last question is, in a short time, how does India become an alternative for the world that is now rethinking its investments in China? This is a question that's been asked again and again, but I think COVID throws it up again. If there is going to be a movement of capital from China, how does India ensure that it is in the advantageous position. So, Ambassador Mohan Kumar, would you like to start with answering those questions? Have we lost him or?
No, I think I'm all right now.
Okay.
I think I was waiting for somebody to unmute me. So very briefly, Suhasini, thank you. Difficult questions. The first one, I think on public health security, I've had a chance to say in other fora that public health security will now assume a much bigger profile. And I expect it to rank or outflank energy security, food security, and national security. I mean, I say this at the risk of being politically incorrect. I think it's we need to spend much more on public health. And I think that is something that states and centers have to get together to do this. So I hope this will be a kind of a tipping point so that the government can spend much more on public health. So that's the first. The second thing, the question I think was about what the government does in terms of an emergency and in normal times. I think those of us who have spent a lot of time in civil service know that Indian civil servants really rise to the occasion if there is a crisis. We know that. I think the problem really is in times of total normalcy, when I think the state doesn't function as efficiently as it should. I mean, it's like the typical Indian marriage. Everything is done at the last minute, and then eventually somehow we manage to get across the finishing line. So crisis is never a problem in India, by the way. The Indian civil servants, I mean, if you go back and look at the crisis, they've done very, very well for themselves. And frankly, some of the IAS officers, you really have to give it to them. The kind of work they do so selflessly 24/7 is remarkable. My issue really is, how do you replicate this in normal times? And I would go back to a system of rewards, incentives and disincentives, which government of India has not been able to do. How do you fire someone who is rank incompetent? It's not a great rocket science. If you ask me in my service, or if you ask an IAS officer in his service, we all know who the competent officers are. We all know who the incompetent officers are, frankly. I mean, it's like every other sector. The problem in the government in normal times is that we are not able to fire the ones who are incompetent. And so you will have to fundamentally rechange or change these rules of hiring and firing. And because of the security of tenure, the Supreme Court judgments, which provide ironclad security for Indian civil servants, it's a problem. But that is my limited answer. The last question which was posed to me, or posed to you rather, it's about what the government can, what India can do to attract investments. Frankly, it's a good beginning. We are, I think, going to strategically screen investments, the policy directive that you were referring to. But I think that's only a beginning, frankly. What we will have to put in place is radical changes in the policy environment, in terms of land acquisition. You see, the fact of the matter is the toughest reforms haven't taken place yet, and they are land, they are labor. And these are the most difficult things to do in India. And my question is, and it's not an answer, unfortunately, I know you're looking for answers. My question is, in an environment like this, can you really have labor reforms? Please tell me. I mean, you've got such a big kind of migrant exodus. People have lost their jobs. So if I go and tell the Niti Aayog or the government now that, listen, can you please give the private industries two things which they want? One, they don't want this rule of number 50. You hire 50 people or less than 50 to have a particular labor law. If you go more than 50, then you really fire. Now you tell people, listen, we want to give you the right of fire. I will be described as a stark raving lunatic to suggest that in the current environment. The second is land acquisition. Again, at a time when property prices have dropped precipitously in India, this is really not the time for these two reforms. So how we are going to attract strategic investments, which may leave China, we are not sure yet, but which may leave, is I think $1 million question. We have some inherent advantages. the domestic market, for example, the pent-up demand during the lockdown, which will dramatically come out into the open. But I think against that, you've got this real constraint in terms of inability to undertake radical reforms at a time like this. Thank you.
All right. I saw Dagmar Walter has her hand up, and possibly it is to respond to some of what you said. Possibly it is to respond to the questions. Go ahead, Dagmar.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to contribute to the question around investment in the health sector and India below 1%. And if we look at, even just taking it up to 4%, which would be something more in line with other OECD and further countries and maybe BRICS countries, if we take those, is that there is a huge potential for job creation here as well. And in fact, that links to, and I want to link it back to education as well. So if one can have really a commitment around this and work together to systematically increase health delivery systems and investment in health, we will get beneficial effects in terms of job growth, in terms of course, has to be associated with the educational system, and actually both youth and I'm thinking also of women can largely participate in that new workforce. So I wanted to, and in particular also, of course, the link to then having more access to health facilities, healthcare, etc., for workers as well. So I think it is a very positive spiral that can be set in motion. Links, of course, also to the extension of social security and health insurance in that sense.
All right. While we have you on, Dagmar, there is a question from Amit Chaudhary of the UN IOM, I think, International Organization of Migration, basically saying, given that current challenging scenario that we're seeing of migrant laborers, how really, and given the lack of technological understanding they have, how are we going to be able to, take forward the idea of finding homes and finding jobs for this migrant labor, which is in any case works in a very ad hoc fashion, a seasonal fashion? How are they going to be able to, enhance their performances, build their skills for survival right now?
Yeah, I think it's not an easy question. Right now, we have a humanitarian situation more than anything else. So that has to be, of course, addressed immediately, and it is in motion, obviously. But then I think what we will be seeing, looking forward a little bit, is that some of these migrant workers may wish to rather stay in the communities where they come from and in those areas. And there, I think really one should link up with this whole idea about building a more local economy, more resilient local economy, and integrate them there. Others may want to come back, yes, but then what does that mean? And is there a kind of matching between supply and demand here? Of course, they will be needed, but really. That brings it to this question around, how, should we continue in this really informal way of working? What are protections and how to implement those? So that needs, further looking at and really working together with the partners to see how that can be improved.
Well, that's really going to be one of those questions people will keep having to come back to, because otherwise every small vulnerability is going to increase exponentially the entire thing. Sanjay Joshi, if I could come back to you with that question I had at the beginning about how energy is going to really, energy security that in fact Ambassador Mohan Kumar had referred to, is really going to now play out. Is fuel, fossil fuel, if you like, going to take a back seat now that it is so cheap as a result of the pandemic? Will it actually become more popular suddenly? Are we going to have enough incentive to move to renewable energies that we have been speaking about in the last few years, but perhaps have not yet gotten to?
Suhasini, if you actually look at the world of energy demand, as well as if you look at the world of emissions, carbon emissions and greening, lockdowns have been good. Lockdowns have resulted in a greener world. Lockdowns have been the most effective tool of cutting down carbon emissions because of the sudden collapse in energy demand which is taking place. Your planes are not flying, your trains are not running, your cars are, wherever they are, they're shuttered up. And not only has that happened, what you're actually seeing is, you have the lowest oil prices. In fact, there is fear in certain areas that, Western Texas Intermediate, WTI, could actually have negative prices. People will actually have to be paid to pick it up because you don't have any storage capacities. So you are, it's a complete turmoil which has shaken up the energy markets right now. Electricity demand has fallen. How long is that going to last? The fact is that as long as degrowth continues, as long as you have low economic growth or negative economic growth, your energy demand will not pick up, your emissions will not rise, and the pressure on countries to take climate action will be that much lesser. The first priority is going to be catch hold of the cheapest. You are going to use the cheapest sources of energy available for some time if you need to kickstart the economy. So most countries, because they are turning inward more and more, because you're going to see less and less of global cooperation in these matters, are probably going to be actually taking advantage of these low prices and trying to kickstart the economies, trying to kickstart somehow, use these low energy prices to start the economies running, to get the engine of the economy running again. Over the longer term, because this also means that you are going to have far fewer investments in fossil fuels for some time. And that is then going to have an impact when demand starts picking up again. So when demand starts picking up again, you may end up in a situation where you have a sudden conflagration in prices all over again. Because you have shuttered capacity, you're trying to kickstart that kind of demand. So that could become the incentive for investments in alternative fuels. So markets are going to decide this to a very, very large extent, especially in the energy sector. We must not forget that. So I see in the short term to medium term, actually, because of low demand, because demand has flattened out, fallen, it is good for the environment, bad news for energy.
All right. Sanjay, very quickly, Nidhi has come up with a question even as you were speaking, saying, while nature is flourishing and carbon emissions are at a low, should the climate funds that we have been collecting really be used for the short time to fund economic growth, because that's the need of the hour?
We don't have very many large climate funds, for that matter. Climate funds have not come to the extent that they were ever anticipated, or that they would address the larger issue of climate change. And the energy market is huge. If you start talking of investments, if you start talking of growth, you need humongous amounts of capital. You're going to have very many alternative means to be able to fund that expansion which is going to take place. The so-called climate funds are going to make up a very, very small packet of that. So I don't think it is worth it. You need to keep on pushing renewables, because eventually, as I said, energy demand will pick up whenever the economies revive. And when the economies revive, at that time we should be better positioned to make the energy transition which we've been aiming for.
All right.
Thank you for the answer.
I'll turn to the questions for Dr. Rajat Nag. Specifically, Utkarsh has asked, and this is interesting because so far all that we have spoken about is getting the industry back, getting the economy roaring again. We haven't touched on consumption demand. Here are all these people who for 40 days have learned to live with less. How are we going to kickstart consumption demand? Will it go back after the pause? That's what Utkarsh is asking. Also, another question from Nidhi Garg, who's a chartered accountant, saying the fear that most companies are just going to run out of cash, even to run one quarter when we come back. So that means when the economy is allowed to reopen, the kickstart itself might kill a lot of industries, for want of a softer word. How do you respond to that? Dr. Nag, are you still there?
Yeah, you have to be. Okay, good. Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Well, I fully share the concerns because I think many of the small and medium enterprises cannot survive for too long. I think till now, most of them are doing a good job of keeping their payroll being met, making sure the salaries are met. And I sit on a couple of boards where we're having a huge challenge of how to balance this humanitarian need. And I think our first loyalty and commitment must be to the workers. But at one point, you do run out of cash. So I think that's a very real, and this is where the banking sector, the financial sector has to come in. Up till now, I think the RBI and the financial sector have been pretty responsive. But the fact still remains that all the loans on which we're getting a moratorium essentially are just postponing the payments. I mean, the interests are piling up, which have to be met. So I think that is a major challenge. And I, for one, do not think that the economy will come roaring back. I think it is going to be a slow, re-emergence of the economies. A lot of the laborers who have somehow been able to get back home, I don't think are going to rush back again to wherever their jobs are without assurance that the same thing won't happen to them again. So I think you're going to see a period, and it is not going to be a sharp V. I think it is going to be more a U and a flattened U to see that happening. And the same applies to the consumption side. People would become very wary of releasing the spigots on consumption, knowing that their own incomes are very vulnerable. So I think we are in for some, even after the lockdown ends, even after the immediate threat of the virus is diminished or mitigated, I think you're going to see, not only in India, globally, a very slow recovery and not just a sharp V.
All right. If I could turn to the questions for Dr. Balveer Arora. We have Puneet Sangvi, who's a design engineer from Mumbai, asking, over time, the government's policy was really to incentivize MSMEs to remain MSMEs. Do you think that's sustainable? And Mishika Nair of Invest India asking, really, what about the ethics involved? Where do we set the ethical bar in a scenario where people are laying off as much as 50% of their, laying off people and reducing the salaries of their employees working full-time from home to 50%. In the media industry, I can tell you there are any number now of organizations that are coming out and putting cuts on. And how do we provide a safety net to people in the private sector? So what about the ethical issues that come out of this? You know, Ambassador Mohan Kumar referred to the competence issues and the need to have a more liberalized labor policy. But what about the ethics?
Yes, I think what this points to, what the questions are hinting at, is the increasing fragilization, if you like, the contractualization of workers. We see this in a number of sectors. We see this with school teachers, the tendency to have them on uncertain contracts. We see this in the university system with college teachers. And we see this all over, the tendency not to take on people with a guaranteed salary at the end of the year. And if they, and often cutting the vacation salary for teachers and for college teachers. Now, what I'm saying is that while there a certain amount of hire and fire flexibility is there, should be there, but to go to the extreme of not giving the benefits of a job security, imagine taking away the salary of teachers during vacation. After all, it's something that cries out as being poor ethics, bad morals, whatever you like. On the question of medium and small industries, I think they deserve the biggest boost. They are the ones who are going to pull us out of this trough that we are in. And there again, how much can they be encouraged, incentivized? And what's holding them back is not the labor laws so much as the question of having the right kind of regulatory and investment incentives atmosphere, which will allow them to flourish.
All right. And very quickly, Dr. Balveer Arora, if you had an answer to that question I'd asked earlier on behalf of Mansi Bhatt, who's a research analyst at Citigroup, a former research analyst at Citigroup, is how do you make sure that the government reforms or changes so that the health sector gets an immediate boost that you had recommended?
For the health sector, yes, I'm glad that this has been picked up. You see, the thing is that first of all, if you want good work, you need to pay a decent salary. You pay peanuts, you get monkeys. This and globally, if you see the way the UK is responding, the way France is responding, all of them have realized that the health system is crucial, and what they invest in the health system to meet this pandemic will serve them in good stead, because this is not the only illness that is going to, all the others have been pushed into the background, but they are there and they will need attention. So the health sector investment, I think it's a public policy. As a social scientist and as a public policy analyst, I think it requires a clear political will. And in a multi-level federal system, I can assure you that the lower levels of the federal system would be willing to go down that route, provided the overall framework and the example came from the center.
All right. If I could, I think Dr. Rajat Nag, you want to come in on Mishka Nayyar's question. Where do we set the ethical bar when it comes to laying off? Go ahead.
Okay, I think the microphone is now on. I think that's a great question and a very difficult question. And we are struggling with it in a couple of companies that I'm involved in. And I don't want to be sounding moralistic or judgmental at all. It is a difficult question because we do not have social safety nets. We do not have social protection. My take is that this is the time when entrepreneurs, the promoters, the owners of the business, the top management and the board, they are going to be tested for their own personal ethics and their character. And I also think, again, the reality is that if you run out of cash, you run out of cash, you can't do anything, and the company itself may go out of business. But people will remember how you handle this period. And I think it could be very good for business, actually, even though it's a temporary dip. It could be excellent for business. So I can only repeat what I'm saying to myself in some of the discussions I'm involved in, that this is not just charity. This is not just the right thing to do. It is also good business.
Right. The challenge is, in fact, an opportunity to shine. Mr. Dipankar Tiwari, the question, would we see permanent changes in working styles of the organizations after the pandemic? This comes to you from Anish Pradhan, an intern at APCO Worldwide. Also a question from Ashish Gupta, dealing with, who's from KAS, asking about whether social media, in a sense, you have now people, literally their social media world and their work world has just fused completely over the last month or so. Do you think that borders are going to be built again, or do you think people are just going to look at work productivity without considering what you do in terms of your other activities online?
Coming to the first question, I think there will be some fundamental changes which will happen as we move forward. Obviously, as I mentioned, the balance between work from home or remote working or distant learning, all of those kind of elements will start playing up, and you would see a lot less of proper travel and so on, which would kind of go away. But in the long run, I mean, I'd say 2 years down the line, I would really see things still coming back to the normal which is there. So there won't be a fundamental shift. Yes, there would be minor adjustments which will continue to happen, and I think that's anyways a part of any. I mean, like, the digital world has transformed a lot of things in the past, and I think that evolution will continue to grow. Some transformations will happen a little faster, but would people really stop going to work at all? I don't think that's going to happen. The social interactions, the physical interactions will continue to happen. So it's a question of a short term, I think, more. In the long run, I hope and I do think that things will come back to normal. The social media, of course, plays a multi-variety role, and we've seen this happen over a period of time. where a lot of groups are, kind of fused together by a common interest and common appreciation of things. And that's going to play into their work side as well. And you'll see a lot more closer collaboration. And I think social media is going to play a very important role there. I think it's going to also shift more from a pure kind of just sharing your personal life to be a more professionally linked in a more deeper manner, both at work and at your home. So I think that's something which is going to be seen in the times to come.
All right. And finally, to Professor Ashish Bhardwaj, I'll ask you to put on your banking and finance hat, if you like. There's a question, I think, that has come from, it was on my chat, but essentially asking that since the IMF has now really put out a warning saying this is from Robin Bhakan, who's a lawyer. According to the IMF, we are heading towards a greater recession, which will be worse than the 2008 recession. Do you think COVID-19 has, in a sense, pressed a pause button on all economies? Or is it going to, is that a pause button, or is it going to be an everlasting negative impact? In a sense, are we just never going to come back to where we were just before? And I should say countries like India were already seeing a huge economic downturn.
Well, thanks for that question. We will most certainly come out of this, not just as a country, but as the world together. That's certain. Crises have come and gone of varying measures and proportions, and this is just another in front of us. It's a good thing that we are more aware as nations, as societies, as industries, as scholars, as citizens. We are more aware, possibly more equipped. There are more technologies to handle across industries, including in banking and finance. I think the key question is not about coming up with new ideas, but having the will and the confidence to implement them in a timely manner. We have multiple challenges, but since the question from Robin is very specific to this industry around banking and finance, I'll try to restrict myself to that. I think there are few things that we need to do, which means it's a shout out to government, to the finance ministry. They need to really consider it ASAP. As some of the other speakers have said, MSMEs are really the foundation, and they have a prominent role to play in India. And this crisis has proved that cash is really the king, and any company which is over leveraged or living on the edge is really very vulnerable, and that includes pretty much the entire MSME industry. It includes a large chunk of family-run businesses, and the Indian economy is dependent on these two elements. So the crisis has shown we need to be financially prudent, conserve cash. It is just easier said than done. But what the ministry should consider is taking advantage of the situation. I'll not hesitate to say that we were not able to do it during the US-China trade dispute. India could have leveraged that in a big way. We could consider doing it now. The government can come up with some really robust suggestions on how to around use of connecting suppliers, looking for purchasers, and vice versa. We could consider building a very healthy infrastructure online, which is what everyone is doing at the moment, but particularly targeted towards the small businesses. Coming back to the question about banking, the RBI is really, increasing liquidity, pumping more money. But it's a welcome move of delaying repayments and payments of loans. But what the smaller businesses are really looking for is some more proactive and some more robust financial support from the government. And bad loans and the norms around it should be looked at very, very carefully, and thinking about those smaller enterprises that are playing a role in exports. I think that should be discussed as early as possible.
All right. And Ashish, since you are in the business of educating the future, the question I'm going to close with from Sukanya of Vicky is over the past decade, we have been consciously adapting to new technologies to try and create jobs of the future, right? This is what we also educate our children to do, is look for jobs of the future. This implies that all of us have to maintain a difficult balance between the need to support the market disruptors who are creating the new technologies, yet at the same time of supporting and helping the transition of those who've been disrupted. How do we make sure that we support those who are disrupted as well as the disruptors themselves?
All right. I wish I knew the answer to that question, really. But I don't really fear any robots replacing people or even working with our people due to any kind of automation or disruptive technologies. I fear our people, graduates, not being able to work with each other for a whole bunch of reasons. But again, a practical advice, if there are any students, transitioning students in this group, recruiters are going to get more selective in their hiring. Dr. Nag mentioned about building skills during this time. So a lot of companies, in my understanding, are going to be looking at how people can innovate and how do they have skills around originality? Do they have the emotional intelligence to deal with these kinds of extreme circumstances? Do they have an understanding of the cultural and sociological dynamics of the society we work and function in? Because organizations honestly don't hire people for the immediate need, just not for today, it's also for tomorrow. And they want people who are comfortable with such disruptions. It's COVID now, it could be low-vid after a few years, we don't know. But people need to be comfortable with this kind of disruption, and the change the disruptions demand is what universities and all higher education institutions must ensure that we are able to deliver to our students.
All right. Thanks so much. And I can't thank our speakers enough today. In terms of trying to sum up everything you have said, I think there are some very cogent and powerful narratives that have come through, which all of you actually shared in common. But I thought what was interesting is that the coronavirus has not only forced a pause in thinking, it has set up a whole series of catch-22s for the world. And how what choice we take in these catch-22s is really going to define what the world's future will be when it comes to the future of work. So on one side, you've got the catch-22. Do you push for connectivity? Do you push for more roads and airwaves and other ways of transporting each other? Or do you push for more communication technology? Do you fuel competence? Or do you keep people in their jobs? Do you move to the future of work with artificial intelligence and robots, or do you actually focus on caring for the current workforce? In fact, as one speaker said, disincentivizing robots at this time. Do you scale up education through online programs, or do you try and work with the digital divide, because otherwise the digital divide is going to get even larger? And are you going to look for interactions and hierarchies and interpersonal skills, all the things management has built its entire theory on, that fuel productivity versus just having people work from home, lowering your overheads, lowering your obligations to that workforce? In a sense, that again becomes a huge catch-22, particularly when the funds are going to be fewer and fewer, and the mouths to feed, in a sense, are going to be more and more. I'd like to end this discussion here by inviting Mr. Peter Rimmel of KAS to offer a vote of thanks. But really, as a moderator, it's been a pleasure chatting with all of you and benefiting from all your insight. I think Peter is still on mute.
Me.
There he is.
Okay, now. Thanks, Suhasini.
Just can I come in for 1 minute before you give the word? Thanks.
Please.
Peter Dilip here. Can I come just? So,
Yes,
you know,
please.
I just wanted to actually, just put on record that the last dialogue was chaired by Mr. Rakesh Bakshi of RRB. Unfortunately, during this period, he passed away. So, I just want to.
Namaskaram, Sadhguru. On behalf of FICCI, FLOW, which is FICCI's ladies organization, and Young FICCI, it's my honor to welcome you and to thank you for spending this time with us. As you know, I was privileged to be with you when you spoke to the healthcare professionals yesterday. As you know, across the world, it's not just the medical data and the economic things which are getting reported widely, but the mental agony that so many people are going through, whether it's fear or uncertainty of the future. So in times like this, all our members are extremely grateful to you for the opportunity to spend this time and gain strength from your knowledge and your insights. So thank you, Sadhguru. I will, a series of our senior members will be asking questions, but I'm going to start off with someone who I know that you have a special fondness for. So may I please call upon Dr. Pratapsee Reddy to ask the very first question. Dr. Reddy, please.
Namaskaram, Reddy garu. Our pranams from everybody in the healthcare and from the people in the country and the world. Sangeeta, I'm very happy.